Somerton Beach lies about 7 miles southwest of the centre of the city of Adelaide, on the eastern shore of the Gulf St Vincent, in the state of South Australia. It is a quiet suburb of a quiet city. In 1948, when this story begins, the population of Adelaide was about 400,000 people. The suburb of Somerton Park was, then as now, a strip of low houses and gardens set back from a long esplanade, above a low sandstone seawall, above a slope of pale sand that ran down, at low tide, for perhaps 200 yards to the water. Behind the dunes, a little inland from the seawall, stood a building called the Somerton Crippled Children's Home. To the north, the tram line from central Adelaide terminated at Glenelg, a short walk up the coast. It was, in almost every way, an unremarkable stretch of Australian coast. At about 6:30 on the morning of Wednesday, the 1st of December, 1948, the first day of the southern summer, an Adelaide jeweller named John Bain Lyons was taking a walk along that esplanade with his wife. The sun had been up perhaps an hour. The tide was low. At the base of the seawall, in the sand, they came upon the body of a man. He was lying on his back, with his head propped against the seawall. His legs were extended straight out in front of him. His feet were crossed at the ankles. His arms lay along his sides. On the collar of his coat, a half-smoked cigarette rested, as though it had fallen from his mouth when his mouth had gone slack. He was well dressed. He looked, at first glance, like a man who had had too much to drink the night before, and had settled himself against the seawall to sleep it off. The Lyonses were not, at first, alarmed. Adelaide in December is warm at dawn. It would have been an odd, but not unheard of place to have passed the night. But the man did not stir when they spoke to him, and when John Lyons came closer, he saw that the man was, in fact, quite dead. The police were called. The body was taken to the Royal Adelaide Hospital, and then to the morgue. And the process began, in the ordinary way, of establishing who this man had been. There is, at this stage of the story, one further piece of the context worth pausing on. In the previous year, 1947, the Australian and British governments had jointly established, in the desert about 280 miles northwest of Adelaide, a place called the Woomera Rocket Range. Woomera was, in 1948, one of the most closely guarded weapons testing sites in the Western world. Long-range missiles were being trialled there, in the empty central Australian desert, under a treaty between London and Canberra. The town of Woomera itself was, for many years, a closed town, its existence not officially acknowledged, and its residents subject to strict security. South Australia, in 1948, was therefore a place of quiet but real intelligence interest. The Cold War was 3 years old. The Soviet defector, Vladimir Petrov, whose defection would rock Australian politics, was still 6 years away. But the newly formed Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, was already, in 1948, watching Adelaide with some care. This context does not, in itself, explain anything about the body on the beach. It does explain some of the theories that would grow up around it over the next 74 years. For the moment, on the morning of the 1st of December, 1948, none of that was in the mind of any of the police officers who came to the seawall at Somerton Beach. What they had, that morning, was a well-dressed, middle-aged man, lying dead in the sand, with no obvious cause of death, and in the pockets of his coat and trousers, nothing whatever to identify him. They did not know it yet, but this simple fact, that no one, then or for the next 7 decades, could say who this man had been, would make his case, in time, one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in Australian history. The first thing the police did at the morgue was to describe him. He was a European-looking man of about 40 to 45 years of age. He was 5 foot 11 inches tall. He had fair to ginger hair, slightly greying at the temples. His eyes, when opened by the pathologist, were grey. He was clean-shaven. His hands were manicured. His nails were clean. He was athletically built. His shoulders were broad. His legs, and in particular the calves of his legs, were unusually well developed, in a way that suggested to the pathologist a man who spent long hours on his feet, perhaps in high-heeled shoes, or in dancing, or in long-distance walking or running. His toes were slightly wedge-shaped in a way that also suggested habitual wear of narrow, pointed footwear. He had the general appearance of a professional man, or possibly a dancer, or possibly a soldier used to standing at attention for long hours. He was dressed in a brown suit, brown trousers, brown pullover, a brown single-breasted coat cut in a style that was, at the time, more American than Australian. His shirt was white. His tie was red with a blue pattern. His shoes were brown and freshly polished. His socks were on. There were labels stitched into some of the garments, but every one of them had been carefully cut out or torn off. The dry cleaning tags, if any had been sewn in, had been removed. The result was that, though everything he was wearing was in good condition and had recently been pressed, none of it could be traced to any tailor, or any laundry, or any city. In his pockets, when the police went through them one by one, they found the following: an unused second-class railway ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach, dated the 1st of December, 1948. A bus ticket from central Adelaide in the direction of Glenelg. An American-made aluminium comb, a half-empty packet of juicy fruit chewing gum, a quarter-full box of Bryant and May matches, and an Army Club cigarette packet containing 7 cigarettes of a different brand. Kensitas. No wallet, no money, no passport, no driving license, no letters, no photographs, no hotel key, no luggage tag, nothing that carried a name, which was, as anyone who has ever emptied their own pockets could tell you, extraordinary. Fingerprints were taken. Post-mortem photographs were made. A plaster cast of the man's face, a death mask, was created a few months later by a taxidermist named Paul Lawson, working with the police, and pressed with real human hairs from the body for later use in identification. This bust still exists. It is held today in the collection of the South Australia Police Historical Society in Adelaide. As we will come to see, the hairs pressed into that plaster in 1949 would matter 70 years later in ways no one at the time could have anticipated. The fingerprints and the photographs were sent, in the ordinary way, to every Australian state and territory police force, and then to Interpol, and to the FBI, and to Scotland Yard. No match was ever returned, from anywhere. 6 weeks later, On the 14th of January, 1949, a suitcase was reported to police from the cloakroom at Adelaide railway station. It had been checked in at about 11 o'clock in the morning on the 30th of November. That is, the day before the body was found on the beach. It had been left and never collected. The station master, having read the newspapers, wondered. The suitcase was brown. It had had a paper label on the outside, but the label had been torn off. Inside, it contained a red dressing gown, a pair of felt slippers, some pajamas, a shaving kit, a small electrician's screwdriver, a modified knife, a stenciling brush of the type used by ship's officers to mark cargo, a ball of orange waxed thread of an unusual brand called Barber, and a pair of trousers, in the cuff turn-up of which was a small quantity of fine sand. The waxed thread was identical to a thread that had been used at some point to repair the pocket of the trousers the man was wearing when he died. So the case was certainly his. Most of the labels inside the case, as with the clothes on the body, had been carefully cut out. On some items that had been missed, 3 inked laundry marks, 1171 7, 4393 7, and 3253 7, and most tantalizingly, 3 variants of a name: T. Keen on a tie, Keen on a laundry bag, Keen on a singlet. Australian police, working with the assumption that they had found the man's name, began a nationwide search for any missing person named Keen. Every state was queried. Every man of the right age. No match was found. Nobody named Keen of that description was missing. The name Keen, it seemed, was, like everything else about him, a false thread. The autopsy was conducted, initially, by a pathologist named John Barclay Bennett. It was reviewed subsequently by the coroner's pathologist John Matthew Dwyer and by the pharmacologist Cedric Stanton Hicks of the University of Adelaide. The findings were unusual. The man's heart was normal. The immediate cause of death was heart failure. But the internal condition of the body was not the condition of a man whose heart had simply stopped. The lining of his throat had been eroded. The lining of his stomach was ulcerated. His stomach contained blood. His spleen was 3 times the normal size. His liver and other viscera were deeply congested. These were the internal findings, Dwyer wrote, of a man who had been poisoned. I am quite convinced, Dwyer told the coroner at the inquest, the death could not have been natural. The poison I suggested was a barbiturate or a soluble hypnotic. Hicks, called next, went further in private and less far in public. He refused to name the specific poisons he suspected in open court, on the grounds that to do so would provide instruction to future murderers. He passed the coroner a piece of paper on which he had written the 2 substances he believed to be responsible: digitalis and strephanthine. Both are natural cardiac glycosides derived from plants. Both are, in the right dose, lethal. Both, in the toxicology of the late 1940s, would decompose in the body very rapidly after death and would leave no chemical trace that could then be detected. The names digitalis and strephanthine were not made public until the 1980s. The coroner, Thomas Cleland, deliberated for another 10 years. The inquest was reopened several times and, in 1958, finally issued his conclusion. I am unable to say who the deceased was, he wrote. I am unable to say how he died or what was the cause of death. That was the state of the case at the end of the 1950s. A man on a beach. meticulously groomed. Every label removed. A suitcase full of things and no name. A body full of the marks of a poisoning that could not be proven. And already, by then, there was one more piece of the puzzle. The piece that would give the case, for the next 60 years, the specific shape by which the world would remember it. It was Dwyer who found it, going over the body's clothes a second time. Some days after the initial examination, he noticed something the first search had missed. On the waistband of the trousers, at the small of the back, where the belt sat, there was a small concealed pocket, sewn into the fabric, a fob pocket, of the sort in which a gentleman of an earlier era might have carried a pocket watch. Inside the pocket, tightly rolled, was a single small scrap of paper. The paper, unrolled, measured perhaps 1.5 inches by 3/4 of an inch. Printed on it, in a small ornate typeface, were 2 words in the Persian language. Tamam Shud. The phrase means in Persian, it is ended, or more literally, it is finished. It is the phrase with which every published edition of the Rubaiyat, the great collection of Persian quatrains attributed to the 11th century mathematician and poet Omar Khayyam, closes. The Rubaiyat was translated into English by the Victorian scholar Edward Fitzgerald in 1859 and became, in the second half of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th, one of the most popular volumes of poetry in the English-speaking world. Dozens of English editions, hundreds of thousands of copies in circulation. The final page of every one of them ended with the same 2 Persian words, printed underneath the last verse. Tamam Shud. The scrap in the fob pocket had been torn from one of those books. The Adelaide police made a public appeal. They asked in the newspapers whether anyone could account for a Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam with the last page torn out. In July of 1949, some months after the appeal, an Adelaide businessman came forward. He said that in late November of the previous year, just days before the body had appeared on the beach, a copy of the Rubaiyat had been thrown mysteriously through the open rear window of his car while it was parked in Jetty Road, in the coastal suburb of Glenelg. He had thought nothing of it at the time. Now, having read about the case, he thought perhaps he should mention it. The book was fetched from where he had put it and taken to the police. It was a rather rare edition, printed in Christchurch, New Zealand, by the firm Whitcomb and Toombs in 1941. The last page had been torn out. Forensically, the torn edge of the scrap found in the Somerton Man's fob pocket fitted, precisely, the torn edge of the missing page. That was enough. This was the book. This was the Rubaiyat, from which the last 2 words had been ripped. But the book, when it was more carefully examined, had 2 further things on it. The first was the letters. On the back cover, faintly indented in pencil, indented so lightly that they were only visible under angled light, was a 5-line sequence of capital letters. The letters, as they are most often given, read W, R, G, O, A, B, A, B, D. Then, with a second line struck through, M, L, O, 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 O. Then, W, T, B, E, M, P, A, N, E, T, P, then MLIABO or QC, and finally ITTMTSAMSTGAB. 50-odd letters in 5 lines on the back of a book, in the handwriting of a man whom no one could identify. The letters were sent immediately to the Australian Naval Intelligence codebreaker, Captain Eric Nave. Nave was one of the great cryptographers of the Second World War. He had helped break Japanese naval codes in the Pacific, and if anyone in Australia could have identified a cipher, he could. He could not. He concluded, after some study, that the letters were unlikely to be, in the technical sense, a cipher at all. The sample was too short. The letter frequency was consistent with the initial letters of English words. And there was, without a key, no way to distinguish any candidate solution from any other. A reasonable explanation, Nave wrote in his report, would be that the lines are the initial letters of words of a verse of poetry or such like. An acrostic, in other words, a mnemonic, a personal shorthand, the initial letters of the lines of a verse the man had had in his head, that he had needed to write down. It has, in the 70-plus years since Nave wrote that report, defeated every serious cryptographer who has looked at it. The Australian Defence Signals Directorate has looked. American and British cryptanalytic services have looked. A generation of academic and amateur cryptographers have looked. The letters remain, as of the recording of this episode, uncracked. The second thing on the book was a telephone number, also penciled on the back cover, also faintly, was an unlisted Adelaide phone number. The police traced it. It belonged to a young woman named Jessica Ellen Thompson, née Harkness, and known to her family and friends by the nickname Jestin or Joe. She was, at that time, a 27-year-old former nurse, living with her infant son Robin in a modest house on Mosley Street in Glenelg. Her house was, this seemed unlikely to be coincidence, about 400 meters from the seawall where the body had been found. The police, without warning, brought her the plaster bust of the Somerton Man and showed it to her. According to the officers present, she was, in the words of the police report, completely taken aback to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint. She then, having composed herself, denied that she recognized him. She did not know him. She had never seen him before. She could not account for how her phone number had come to be written in the back of a Rubaiyat. The police pressed. She said, as if reaching for anything, that during her time as an army nurse in Sydney during the war, she had given a signed copy of the Rubaiyat, inscribed with a verse, to a lieutenant named Alfred Boxall. Perhaps, she said, that book had made its way somehow to Adelaide. Alfred Boxall was traced. Alfred Boxall was still alive. He was living in Sydney. His copy of the Rubaiyat was on his shelf. It was intact. The dead man on the beach was not Boxall, and the copy of the Rubaiyat found in the car was not Jestin's inscribed gift. And Jestin, questioned again, could not say anything more. She kept, until she died in 2007, whatever she knew. The retired Adelaide detective, Gerry Feltus, who worked on the Somerton case for many years and wrote the definitive book about it, The Unknown Man, in 2010, said, publicly, what many of the officers who had questioned Justin Thompson believed in private. "It is my opinion," Feltus said, "that the nurse knew the identity of the unknown man. He did not believe he could ever prove it. Justin herself, to the end of her life, never acknowledged the case in public. Her daughter, Kate Thompson, has said in interviews that her mother once implied that the identity of the man was known to a level higher than the police force. Neither Kate nor anyone else has been able to substantiate that claim." There was, for many years, further attention paid to Justin Thompson's son Robin. Robin had been born in 1947, the year before the death on the beach. He grew up to become an Australian ballet dancer. He died of natural causes in 2009. It was noted by researchers of the case that Robin possessed two rare anatomical traits: a specific dental variation in which his upper lateral incisors were, from birth, absent, and a specific formation of the outer ear in which the upper cavity was larger than the lower, both of which the Somerton Man had also had. Each trait is found in perhaps 1 to 2% of the population. The combination, in an unrelated man, is rare enough that some researchers estimated the odds at 1 in 10 to 20 million. The obvious inference, for a long time, was that the Somerton Man was Robin's biological father, and therefore that Justin Thompson had known him rather better than she had said. As we will come to see, in a moment, this inference turned out to be wrong. For 50 years, from 1948 to the late 1990s, the case stood essentially where the coroner, Thomas Cleland, had left it. A body without a name, a book without a solution, a woman who had died without ever admitting to whatever she may have known. The theories, in that half-century, multiplied. The Somerton Man was a Cold War spy, sent to observe the Woomera rocket range, poisoned by the Soviets or by his own side, for reasons that no one could establish. He was a merchant sailor, whose stenciling brush had given him away, who had died of an illness he had not known he had. He was a professional dancer, whose calves gave him away, who had come to Adelaide to find someone. He was Justin Thompson's former lover, the father of her child, who had come to see her one more time and had been rejected, and had, in his grief, taken his own life on the beach where they had once walked. He was a merchant seaman named T. Keane, or Keane, whose family had simply never come forward. None of these stories could be proven. All of them found supporters. The case became, over the second half of the 20th century, one of the great open questions of Australian criminology. Every generation of detectives in Adelaide inherited it and left it, in turn, to the next. In the mid-1990s, a professor of electrical and electronic engineering at the University of Adelaide, named Derek Abbott, a British-born academic who had come to Australia for his career, became, in his spare time, interested in the case. He had read about it. He was intrigued by the code. He began, initially as a hobby, to correspond with the surviving people in the case and to research the possibilities for identification. Along the way, this is one of the stranger threads in the whole story. Abbott made contact with the family of Justin Thompson. He came to know Justin's granddaughter, Rachel Egan, the daughter of Robin Thompson. Rachel had, herself, long suspected some family connection to the case. They developed a relationship. They later married. They have children, which is to say, Derek Abbott, the leading contemporary researcher of the Somerton Man case, is married into the family of one of the case's central and unwilling witnesses. Abbott spent, from the late 1990s onward, the better part of 2 decades advocating, publicly and privately, for the exhumation of the Somerton Man's body. He believed, correctly as it turned out, that modern DNA technology, applied to a good sample from the remains, could resolve the identity question. For most of that time, the South Australian government refused. The remains had been buried in 1949 in West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide. There was a plaque. There was no clear public interest, the authorities maintained, in disturbing them. In October of 2019, the South Australian Attorney General, Vicky Chapman, changed her mind. Exhumation was authorised. On the 19th of May, 2021, the body of the Somerton Man was removed from its grave and taken, in careful custody, to the Forensic Laboratory at Forensic Science South Australia, where a team began the slow work of extracting DNA from teeth and bone. In parallel, and this is the crucial move, Derek Abbott had, some years earlier, obtained something else. He had obtained, from the South Australia Police Historical Society, some of the human hairs that had been pressed in 1949 into the plaster of the death mask. Those hairs, rootless, degraded, but still containing usable trace DNA in their shafts, were sent to an American forensic genealogist named Colleen Fitzpatrick at a company called Identifinders International, based in California. Fitzpatrick is one of a small number of forensic genealogists in the world who specialize in extracting DNA profiles from very old, very degraded biological samples and then matching them against consumer genealogy databases, GE-Match, Family Tree DNA, and others, to identify unknown people via their distant cousins. Her past work included the identification of the Buckskin Girl, a Jane Doe from 1981, whose case had been unsolved for 37 years. She had also, along with several other genealogists, contributed to the arrest of the Golden State Killer in 2018. Fitzpatrick developed, from the hairs on the death mask, a partial DNA profile. She uploaded it to the databases. She received in return a scattering of very distant cousin matches, none closer than the 4th or 5th degree, on both the maternal and the paternal side. Then, with Abbott, she began to build the family tree. Working outward from each of the cousin matches, they traced ancestries backward, sometimes into the 18th century, and then forward again, looking for people alive in 1948 who could have been the man on the beach. The tree they eventually built contained, by their account, about 4,000 people. At the intersection of the maternal and paternal lineages, the point at which one man on the tree was descended from both, there was, in the end, exactly one candidate. In all this soup and ocean of DNA cousins, Fitzpatrick said afterward, we were able to connect one of them to Carl's father and one of them to Carl's mother. His name, Fitzpatrick and Abbott, announced on the 26th of July 2022, was Carl Charles Webb. Carl Webb had been born in Footscray, in the western suburbs of Melbourne, in the state of Victoria, on the 16th of November, 1905. He would have been, on the day he died on the beach at Somerton, 43 years old. His father, Richard August Webb, was a Melbourne baker of German descent. His mother, Eliza Amelia Grace, was Melbourne-born. Carl was the 6th of 7 children. He had been trained as an electrical engineer and instrument maker. He had, in his lifetime, held a series of positions at engineering firms in Melbourne. He had lived, quietly, with his family. He had also, according to the divorce papers filed against him some years after his death, written a great deal of poetry. In 1941, at the age of 35, he had married a 21-year-old podiatrist named Dorothy Jean Robertson, known as Jo or as Doff. They had lived in a small flat on Bromby Street in the Melbourne suburb of South Yarra. They had no children. By 1946, the marriage was in difficulty. In April of 1947, Carl left. Dorothy, some months later, moved to South Australia. She would, in 1952, file for divorce on the grounds of desertion, describing her missing husband. She did not know he was dead, as moody, sometimes violent, and given to writing poems, most of them, in her words, on the subject of death, which he claims to be his greatest desire. Carl Webb was estranged by 1947 from most of his surviving family. His younger brother Roy had died as a prisoner of war in Burma in 1943. A nephew had died on Royal Australian Air Force service in the United Kingdom in 1943. His sister Frida, this is the missing thread, was married to a man named Thomas Keane. The T. Keane markings on the suitcase, it now appears, were most likely hand-me-downs from his brother-in-law, a small material trace of a family from which Carl had, some months earlier, withdrawn. That is, if the DNA identification is correct, who the Somerton Man was. An electrical engineer from Melbourne, a poet of sorts, a man in a failed marriage, a man estranged from what remained of his family, a man whose wife had, coincidentally or not, relocated to South Australia, a man who, in late November of 1948, checked a suitcase into Adelaide railway station in the morning and, some 48 hours later, was found dead against a seawall in a suburb of that city, with every label removed from his clothes and no identification on his person. The paternity question, incidentally, was resolved by the same DNA work. Rachel Egan, Justin Thompson's granddaughter, Robin Thompson's daughter, was tested. Her paternal DNA does not match Carl Webb. Robin Thompson, therefore, was not Webb's biological son. The two rare anatomical traits, which for 70 years had seemed to prove a connection between the Somerton Man and Justin Thompson's child, were, apparently, a coincidence, which, given the estimated 1 in 10 million odds, is itself a small strange thing worth pausing on. The formal legal position, as of the recording of this episode, is that the South Australia Police have quietly corroborated the identification, but have not yet issued a definitive public announcement. A very small number of geneticists have raised technical questions about Abbott and Fitzpatrick's methodology. The samples were degraded. The cousin matches distant. The underlying data not fully published. Most in the field consider the identification sound. Some do not. The best that can honestly be said at this moment is that the man on the beach was, almost certainly, Carl Webb, which is not the same as saying that we now understand what happened. There is a temptation, when a cold case is finally identified, to think that the mystery is over. It rarely is. It is only that the questions have changed shape. Here are the questions that, in the case of Carl Webb, remain open tonight. The first is the code. The penciled letters on the back of the Rubaiyat, the acrostic that has defeated 70+ years of cryptographers, is still uncracked. Since Carl Webb was identified in 2022, several researchers have gone back to it with fresh context. They now know that the man who wrote it was a Melbourne electrical engineer who read poetry, and in his wife's account wrote a great deal of it on the subject of death. That context has not so far unlocked the letters. It may be that the letters are the initial letters of the words of a verse he wrote himself, or that he was fond of, or that he was trying to remember on the night before he died. It may be that they are a list of names, or of dates, or of places. It may be that they are, as some have long suspected, a suicide note in a private shorthand, a farewell that only he was ever meant to read. Whatever they were, they still say, to the trained cryptographer, exactly what they said in 1949, which is nothing anyone else can be sure of. The second question is why he was there. Carl Webb had, so far as anyone has yet been able to establish, no reason to be in Adelaide on the 30th of November, 1948. He had lived his whole life in Melbourne. His work, his family, his few remaining connections were in Victoria. His only known link to South Australia was his estranged wife Dorothy, who had moved to a small country town called Butte, about 140 kilometres north of Adelaide, some months earlier. It is possible that he came to see her. It is possible that he had come to plead for a reconciliation, and had failed, and had made his way back to the city, and had settled his affairs, and had died. It is possible he had come to look for her, and not been able to find her. It is possible that he had come to Adelaide for some other reason entirely that had nothing to do with her. No one has found a hotel register that lists him. No one has found a witness who saw him. No one has found a ticket stub from Melbourne to Adelaide. His movements between his last confirmed sighting in Melbourne in mid-1948 and the moment he checked a suitcase into the cloakroom at Adelaide railway station on the morning of the 30th of November are unaccounted for. The third question is what, if anything, Jestin Thompson knew. She lived until 2007. She never, in her life, publicly acknowledged the case. She never, according to those who knew her, spoke of the man on the beach. Her phone number was in the back of his book. He was found less than half a kilometre from her house. She was visibly and uncontrollably shocked when the police showed her his death mask. She may have known him. She may have met him once. In some circumstance we do not know. She may never have met him at all, and simply been shocked by the sudden proximity to her home of a strange death. Her daughter Kate, who has been generous in her comments about the case, has said only that her mother implied, indirectly, that she knew more than she said. But Jestin is gone, and the granddaughter, Rachel Egan, married into the case, has said publicly that she does not know what her grandmother knew, and that she has made her peace with never knowing. The fourth question is how he died. The autopsy, in 1948, indicated poisoning. The specific poison, probably digitalis, possibly strophanthine, possibly a barbiturate, could not be detected by the toxicology of the time. Modern re-examination of the exhumed remains, 70 years on, has not been able to detect any of these substances either, which is not surprising. Glycoside poisons decompose in the body very quickly, and after 7 decades in the ground, there is essentially no soft tissue left to test. The leading medical hypothesis is that Carl Webb, alone, on a beach, in a suit from which he had removed every label, having spent his last hours writing an acrostic on the back of a book of Persian poetry that ended with the words "It is finished," took his own life. This is consistent with everything in his history: the failed marriage, the estrangement, the poems on the subject of death that his wife described in her divorce papers, the meticulous removal of every identifying trace from his person, the calm posture in which he was found. It is a plausible reading. It is not the only reading. Homicide has not been ruled out, nor has the possibility that he took ill of natural causes and simply died where he sat. The most honest answer to how he died is what the coroner Cleland said in 1958, that we are still unable to say. We now know his name. He was Carl Webb, born in Footscray, Melbourne, in 1905, dead in Somerton, Adelaide, in 1948, aged 43. He was an electrical engineer. He wrote poems. He was married and unhappily so. He was estranged from what remained of his family. He was, by the accounts of the very few people who knew him well, difficult and sad. We do not know why he came to Somerton Beach. We do not know how he died. We do not know what he was trying to say on the back of a book, in a hand no one has been able to read. But we know at least that he was somebody, which is more than the police in Adelaide in 1948 could ever have said of him. There is, at the West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide, a small stone. The stone was placed there in the 1950s, when it seemed likely that no one would ever come to claim him. The inscription reads quietly, "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach, 1st Dexter, 1948. The stone has not, at the time of the recording of this episode, been changed. Some who have been to Adelaide say the stone should now be updated. Some say that, for a man who took such careful trouble to leave no name behind, it is fitting that the stone be left as it is. For 74 years, the sea has come in and gone out again in front of that grave. The tide has risen and fallen. The suburb has changed. The crippled children's home is gone. The tram still runs to Glenelg. And on the 1st of December, in some years when the anniversary falls on a warm morning, there are people who go down to the seawall quietly and stand for a little while and look at the place where the man was found. They do not mostly know what he was doing there. Neither, still, do we.